And welcome to the third set of slides where the focus is on administering your survey. So this session is just thinking through some of the options you have for how you deliver your questionnaire, doing some thinking about the importance of response rates and what we might do in terms of strategies to maximise those response rates, and then really thinking about why that's important in the context of generalisability. So some of the options, or two of the options really, for delivering questionnaires. We used to run this session, dividing the session in terms of delivering questionnaires in paper versus electronic, as well as these two options here of in person or remotely. And obviously, as time's gone on, and particularly in the current times of the pandemic, we are really moving right away from paper questionnaires. There's still a place for them in some studies, but I'm assuming here that any questionnaire that you distribute is going to be sent in an online format, an electronic format, if you like, rather than via paper. So this slide is just for you to do some thinking about whether it might be important with your particular group of participants to deliver the questionnaire sort of in person. So I don't mean necessarily physically in person, particularly not at the moment, but perhaps by phone or Skype or video call of some kind to actually speak through the questionnaire with your respondents in person, rather than leaving it for them to fill in on their own. And there are obvious pros and cons to each of those choices. And in the next slide, we're going to just do a bit of thinking about what those pros and cons might be. So in terms of, just to finish off here, just to think about some of those options for online, that might mean that we distribute our survey or questionnaire via Twitter or other social media platform. Facebook is sometimes used for that, and email. Those are the sort of main options really. And as I say, with different platforms, there are different pros and cons, and it's really quite important you just acknowledge those and think about how that changes who's got access to your questionnaire. Okay, so here we have a summary of the pros and cons of those two options that you might be considering for your questionnaire in your evaluation. So these are fairly self-explanatory. I don't feel we need to go through every single point, but just to highlight a key advantage of delivering your questionnaire in person is that this is a much more inclusive approach, obviously for those with lower literacy skills, and increases the completion of the questionnaire because you're sat together and you're explaining the questions and clarifying any confusions and so on. The difficulty, the main disadvantage, and often the reason why we don't take this option, is the increased costs for your time in actually administering it to each of your respondents. And that's often a barrier to this approach. So it's always a balance. These decisions are in evaluation are always a balance. The key advantage of delivering your survey remotely is that you can target a very large population with that. And ultimately achieve a decent response rate. However, we know, because people receive a lot of such communications, that completion isn't great, and so we can suffer with a low response rate. And another key disadvantage I just wanted to highlight is, of course, this assumes people have the access to that mode of delivery that you've chosen. So if you're choosing email, we need to have access, permission, and a list of email addresses. It assumes people are on email, and we immediately start excluding people who perhaps don't use things like email and social media. So we really need to think about the profile of people that we're able to reach in this way. So what I've said so far has made some assumptions. You've already done some thinking about who will receive your questionnaire. So at this point, I just want to share with you a few top tips to help you think about sampling in relation particularly to an evaluation study. So how you sample will depend on your need for generalisable results and the time and resources you have available, and that's just an inevitable fact. And if generalisability is important, then a representative sample is needed, and you need to use probability sampling methods which give everyone in your population a chance of being included. And there are some computer software programs that help you generate a simple random sample. it might be necessary in some studies to think about how certain subgroups in the population are represented, and that you want to seek methods to help you ensure they're represented in sufficient numbers, and ideally those that reflect the sort of proportions in your population. And that would be stratified sampling, and that's getting a bit more technical, and for which you might want to seek some expert advice. If generalisability isn't important, then you can use non-probability sampling methods, and those are the more hand-picked methods where we might approach people who we feel have got the relevant experience and perspective to take part in the study. In terms of how we access people and who we actually approach, we can use existing databases and records, and those are commonly used, obviously with the necessary permissions, but do consider who might be excluded from official lists, and if it's important that you find a way to engage those other groups. And what about sample size? Well, this is something I get asked a lot, especially when we do our face-to-face course. And there are formal sample size calculation methods which would be necessary for generating a representative sample. And for that, I would definitely encourage you to seek advice from a statistician. There are some quite useful online sample size calculators, which will give you a rough and ready figure if you're just not really sure, what kind of size you're talking about at all in relation to an evaluation in particular. And you may just aim to get as many responses as you can in the time and resources available. And that's just, as I say, sometimes the restrictions we are working with, and we often take quite a pragmatic approach to evaluation. And in that case, I just encourage you to be guided by your own common sense about how many feels like enough in the context of your study. And if you just compare the numbers we might look for if we evaluate a small local service not used by hundreds of people compared to a large regional programme evaluation where we would be expecting larger numbers, that might just help make the point. So if you do have time constraints, you may have to accept that your sample isn't going to be large or representative, and we'll talk later in the slides more about how to handle that. So we're going to, I've sort of dropped in there that response rate is a really key issue with questionnaires. It's one of our biggest challenges, but there are things, just to encourage you, there are things that we can do to try and boost response rate. But a really good understanding of what we mean by response rate and what we can do about it will really help in your evaluation. Okay, so this is an opportunity to pause the slides and have a read through these questions and decide which ones you agree with and disagree with. Okay, so assuming you've had a chance to note down your thoughts, let's go through some of these together. So firstly, response rate means that everyone answered the survey who was supposed to. I hope you put disagree with this. Response rate can be expressed as a proportion. It's the proportion of those who replied to our survey out of the total number who were given the opportunity to reply. So it's a proportion of who responded. We're going to just cover some more detail about that in the later slides. There is one standard response rate. Again, I would disagree. There's maybe a response rate we aspire to, but it's not something we are always going to achieve. So there isn't an agreed standard response rate. A higher response rate helps us be more sure the findings represent everyone in the study population. This is a really important concept, and we're going to repeat that, revisit that in the rest of this session, and really make sure that has been understood. People will respond or not. There's little we can do about it. Well, I'm hoping to show again in the remaining slides, there's absolutely things we can do about it and try and maximise our response rate. And if your response rate is low, explain your results relative to those who responded. Again, like point 3, this is really important because sometimes despite our best efforts, we aren't able to improve our response rate, but we can explain the results within that context of what we know about those who responded compared to those who didn't. So as I said just now, response rate is the proportion of those who returned the survey questionnaire out of the total number to whom the survey was distributed. So that example there just illustrates if we gave out 250 questionnaires or sent out our link to 250 people and we got 85 back, then we can calculate that as a response rate of 34%. So just to make that absolutely clear. And it's a good thing for us to report in any evaluation report or summary that we express our response rate as a percentage. And this is why it really matters that we are open about our response rate and that we do our absolute best to achieve the highest response we can, because this really promotes confidence in our results, and our study is much more likely to be generalisable to other groups or to the wider population. I'm going to come back to explain generalisability when we've gone a little bit further in the slides. A low response rate increases the likelihood of biased results. In other words, that we can't truly claim we have results that are representative of all the subgroups that we might be interested in our survey. So subgroups might be things like age. So we might have a sort of what we call skewed distribution towards perhaps the lower ages, when what we really need is to have a range of ages across the population. And similarly with other important categories, perhaps ethnicity, socio-demographic group, disease severity, whatever it is we're interested in, we need to look within those subgroups. And this becomes problematic if we want to use the estimates from our survey for giving statistics about things like prevalence of a disease, perhaps. So this just sort of emphasises this is an important thing and why that we need to pay attention to in questionnaire design, and it really relates to the value of the data we generate from our questionnaire. So earlier we agreed there's no standard response rate, so we're aiming really for the higher the better. And while it's not actually the proportion that we achieve that matters, but who responds, and we're going to talk about that a bit later. In general, the general principle is a higher response rate means we can be more sure that the answers reflect our population, and that's a really important concept that I'm going to mention again later in this session. And so that's our goal, and therefore we want to really do everything we can to remove any barriers and things which might stand in the way of people completing the questionnaire, and motivate as many people as we can to complete it in order to achieve the highest response rate that we can. So in the rest of this session, we're going to focus on how we can do that. Again, another opportunity for you to just perhaps pause the slides and have a think about this. You know, often we can draw on our own knowledge of things and experience we've already had about things like maximising response rates. So just encourage you to take a minute or two to just write down some ideas about how you might increase the response rate of your questionnaire. You know about your target population and what might make a difference to them in particular. And it's good to draw on that knowledge you have already. But also just think, as a consumer, we are bombarded with requests to complete surveys, even if they're quite quick and short customer surveys. But it can be really off-putting. So think about all the things that make you want to complete or not complete a questionnaire that you're given, and just make a note of those. And that, again, using that knowledge you've already got will boost your own questionnaire and the response rate. So maximising the response rate is absolutely the ambition here, and we need to do all we can to achieve that. So just in this slide, I want to just link back to remind you of the things we covered in the previous sessions about writing questions, where we really honed in on that important point to keep your questionnaire as short as possible, as concise and as relevant to your big question as you possibly can. So always testing yourself on whether all of the questions are absolutely necessary to help you answer your aims, and making it as easy to complete as we can. So all of those sort of points we raised about writing questions and designing your questionnaire are come into play here. So what can we do to encourage response? So the first thing I would just point out the importance of is very simple, but the positive regard and respect we can show for respondents, those who are receiving the survey, by perhaps, if we can, personally addressing our contact, our email, however we've approached people, giving a clear reason for the survey, which just shows respect for their time and trying to illustrate the importance of what we're asking them to do. To do that, we might want to make it absolutely clear why this survey topic is relevant to them, so that they can see the value of it and how their contribution might make a difference. And we can clearly state the study purpose and, as I say, explain why this piece of work is being done, what difference it could potentially make. And if we can, making a personal connection to the topic so that people feel some investment in taking part. Thinking about the timing of when we distribute a survey is an important thing to consider. And sometimes we're in our own busy schedules and the pressures of project deadlines and so on, we just think about getting things out as fast as possible. But taking a moment to consider what other local or even possibly national surveys are happening at the same time might save us from overburdening the same group of participants with more than one survey, which will massively affect our response rate. And similarly, we want to consider any busy periods for those people that we might know about. Sometimes in a work context, there are really busy times in the year, and we would want to avoid those. And for all of us, we would want to avoid holiday seasons. So December, July and August are all months I would avoid sending out a survey. As we said before in the previous sessions about writing and designing questionnaires, making it look interesting, attractive, professional, the layout and the way we present things, it can be really important to whether people feel they want to engage. And just a quick word about incentives. Sometimes there are mixed views about this, and sometimes it's deemed perhaps to not be ethical, and we would need to ensure that it was within any ethical guidelines that we need to comply with. But we could consider sometimes a small financial incentive for returning a questionnaire or replying to a questionnaire. And we might wish, if we feel it might be more popular or more suitable for that audience, that rather than offering money to an individual, that we would make a charitable donation in their name if they are to reply. A small donation is usually acceptable, or a similar idea of offering to put any respondents who reply, putting them into a prize draw for a sort of larger sort of financial prize, which they have a chance of receiving. And ultimately, with just that management of that sort of just good practice, good manners in showing appreciation of their support, and simple thank yous at the end of a survey is really important and can make quite a difference. So just a couple more common sense pieces of advice about things to avoid. Difficulty, as we talked about in the writing question session, avoiding those complex questions which are difficult to follow, and particularly avoiding those complex instructions which should help you navigate through the questionnaire, keeping those to a minimum. Again, a reminder about reducing the perceived effort of responding, and once again, I can't say it enough really, make the survey short and as easy as possible to complete. And one thing we might have done using paper questionnaires is, of course, to provide return postage. So if it is perhaps some of you may be considering a paper questionnaire, that's a thing that's worth considering. But I realise with electronic surveys that that point doesn't apply, and that's again one of their wide appeals is it's free to distribute and free to return. And give an idea of how long the survey takes to complete, but be absolutely honest. It would be unwise to sort of cut that time down and a 30-minute questionnaire, and you're still not very far along after 10 minutes, people will quit. And quite often in the electronic surveys, there's a sort of completion bar that's visible along the bottom, and of course people can see their progress as they're going along, so they know how far they've got to go. So you need to be absolutely honest about the time. And then finally, just a reminder about minimising the requests for personal information. Of course, we're all governed by GDPR regulations, and it's really important we're not collecting data that we're not allowed to. And any information that is collected of that kind, we must give an explanation and assure our respondents absolutely of our confidentiality in the handling and processing of the data. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, response rate remains low. And at some point, we just have to draw the line and say we've done all that we can to boost that response rate, and we have to settle with the sample size that we've achieved. In that instance, it's just important to put some thought into understanding really those who responded and how they're different from those who didn't. And just to consider, therefore, how typical the people are who've replied of the population that we were aiming to target. So we may not know a lot about the people who didn't respond, but we'll have some idea of who the survey was available to. So we want to just be able to say something about the people who responded in comparison to those who didn't. And then it's just really important to stick to any description of your results in terms of those who responded. And it's most important that we don't in any way imply that our results apply to anyone else who didn't respond to the survey. And so a statement, a sort of a caveat around our results of the kind given there on the slide is really important to include in your evaluation report, a sort of warning, if you like, about who the results apply to and how safely we can sort of generalize from those results. And with a low response rate, really we can't confidently say those results are applicable to any other population other than those who applied. So a statement to that effect is the best you can do. And for that reason, I wanted to wrap up this session with a brief word about generalisability, because another term for generalisability is external validity, by which we mean the extent to which the results of our questionnaire survey, which we've based on a sample of individuals, can be generalised to the wider population that we're interested in. In other words, really, it's about the usefulness of our data and how far we can apply that to others who weren't in the study. And this is very much affected by the decisions we've taken about sampling and who the survey has been distributed to, and the response rate that we've managed to achieve. So who is in our survey, as we were just saying in the previous slide, what we know about them compared to those who didn't reply, how many people replied and the response rate we've achieved, and where and when those people were situated, which just gives us that context about our study, enables us to make a judgment about its generalisability to other groups. And also just to link back to what we were saying before in the previous session about validity and reliability, that external validity is affected by internal validity too. In other words, those things that go on within the study, such as how we measured outcomes, and knowing if those measures we used were valid and reliable. So these are the conclusions from this session and some key points from the session before on writing questions for your questionnaire, which will be a good sort of checklist to keep to hand when you get to the stage of actually writing your own tool. And then in the next session, we're going to talk about preparing your data for analysis.